All right, let's go. Last.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to part 5 of James and the Giant Peach. It seemed a long time before the seagulls were able to pull the peach away from that horrible rainbow cloud, but they managed it at last. And then everybody gathered around the wretched centipede and began arguing about the best way to get the paint off his body. He really did look like a sight. He was purple all over, and now that the paint was beginning to dry and harden, he was forced to sit very stiff and upright, as though he were encased in cement, and all 42 of his legs were sticking out straight in front of him like rods. He tried to say something, but his lips wouldn't move. All he could do now was to make gurgling noises in his throat. The old green grasshopper reached out and touched him carefully on the stomach.
But how could it possibly have dried so quickly?
He asked.
It's rainbow paint.
James answered.
Rainbow paint dries very quick and very hard.
I detest paint.
Miss Spider announced.
It frightens me. It reminds me of Aunt Spiker, the late Aunt Spiker, I mean, because the last time she painted her kitchen ceiling, my poor darling grandmother stepped into it by mistake when it was still wet, and there she stuck. And all through the night we could hear her calling to us, saying, "Help, help, help!" And it was heartbreaking to listen to. But what could we do? Not a thing until the next day when the paint had dried. And then, of course, we all rushed over to her and calmed her down and gave her some food. Believe it or not, she lived for 6 months like that, upside down on the ceiling with her legs stuck permanently in the paint. She really did. We fed her every day. We brought her fresh flies, straight from the web. But then on the 26th of April last, Aunt Sponge, the late Aunt Sponge, I mean, happened to glance up at the ceiling, and she spotted her. "A spider!" she cried. "A disgusting spider! Quick, fetch me the mop with the long handle." And then, oh, it was so awful, I can't bear to think of it.
Miss Spider wiped away a tear and looked sadly at the centipede.
"You poor thing,"
she murmured.
"I do feel sorry for you."
It has never come off,
the Earthworm said brightly.
Our centipede would never move again. He'll turn into a statue and we shall be able to put him in the middle of the lawn with a bird bath on the top of his head.
We could try peeling him like a banana,
the old green grasshopper suggested.
Or rubbing him with sandpaper,
the Ladybug said.
Now if he stuck out his tongue,
the Earthworm said, smiling a little for perhaps the first time in his life.
If he stuck it out really far, then we can all catch hold of it and start pulling. And if we pulled hard enough, we could turn him inside out and he would have new skin.
There was a pause while the others considered this interesting proposal.
I think
James said slowly.
I think that the best thing to do.
Then he stopped.
What was that?
He asked quickly.
I heard a voice. I heard someone shouting.
They all raised their heads, listening.
there it is again.
But the voice was too far away for them to hear what it was saying.
"It's a cloud man!"
Miss Spider cried.
"I just know it's a cloud man. They're after us again."
It came from above.
The Earthworm said, and automatically everyone looked upward. Everybody except the centipede, who couldn't move. They said,
Help! Mercy!
We're going to catch it this time.
for what they now saw swirling and twisting directly over their heads was an immense black cloud, a terrible, dangerous, thundery-looking thing that began to rumble and roar even as they were staring at it. And then, from high up on the top of the cloud, the far-away voice came down to them once again, this time very loud and very clear.
On with the faucets!
It shouted.
On with the faucets! On with the faucets!
3 seconds later, the hole underneath of the cloud seemed to split and burst open like a paper bag, and then out came the water. They saw it coming. It was quite easy to see because it wasn't just raindrops. It wasn't just raindrops at all. It was a great solid mass of water that might have been like a lake or a whole ocean dropping out of the sky on top of them. And down it came, down and down and down, crashing first onto the seagulls and then onto the perch itself, while the poor travelers shrieked with fear and groped around frantically for something to catch a hold of. The peach stem, the silk strings, anything they could find, and all of the time the water came pouring and roaring down upon them, bouncing and smashing and sloshing and slashing and swashing and swirling and surging and whirling and gurgling and gushing and rushing, and it was like being pinned down underneath the biggest waterfall in the world and not being able to get out. They couldn't speak, they couldn't see, they couldn't breathe. And James Henry Trotter, holding on madly to one of the silk strings above the peach stem, told himself that this must surely be the end of everything at last. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the deluge stopped. They were out of it, and it was all over. The wonderful seagulls had flown right through it and had come out safely on the other side. Once again, the peach was sailing peacefully through the mysterious moonlit sky.
I am drowned!
Gasped the old green grasshopper, spitting out water by the pint.
It's gone right through my skin.
The earthworm groaned.
I always thought my skin was waterproof, but it isn't. Now I'm full of rain.
Look at me! Look at me!
Shouted the centipede excitedly.
It washed me clean. The paint's all gone. I can move again.
That's the worst news I've heard in a long time.
The earthworm said. The centipede was dancing around the deck and turned somersaults in the air and sung at the top of his voice.
Oh, hooray for the storm and the rain. I can move. I don't feel any pain. And now I'm a pest. I'm the biggest and best and the most marvelous pest once again.
Oh, do shut up.
The old green grasshopper said.
Look at me.
Cried the centipede.
Look at me. I am free. I'm free. Not a bruise or a bleed. To his grave this fine gent they all thought they had sent, and I very near went. Oh, I very near went. But they sent quite the wrong centipede.
How fast we are going all of a sudden.
The ladybug said.
I do wonder why.
I don't think the seagulls like this place any better than we do.
James answered.
I imagine they want to get out of it as soon as they can. They got a bad fright in that storm we've just been through.
Faster and faster flew the seagulls, skimming across the sky at a tremendous pace, while the peach trailing out behind them. Cloud after cloud went by on either side, all of them ghostly white in the moonlight, and several more times during the night the travelers caught glimpses of cloud men moving around on the tops of these clouds, working their sinister magic upon the world below. Once they passed a snow machine in operation, with the cloud men turning the handle and a blizzard of snowflakes blowing out of the great funnel above. they saw the huge drums that were used for making thunder, and the cloud men beating them furiously with long hammers. They saw the frost factories and the wind producers and the places where cyclones and tornadoes were manufactured and sent spinning down toward the earth. And once, deep in the hollow of a large, billowy cloud, they spotted something that could have only been a cloudmen's city. There were caves everywhere, running into the cloud, and at the entrances to the caves, the cloudmen's wives were crouching over little stoves with frying pans in their hands, frying snowballs for their husbands' suppers, and hundreds of cloudmen's children were frisking about all over the place and shrieking with laughter and sliding down the billows of the cloud on toboggans. An hour later, just before dawn, the travelers heard a soft whooshing noise above their heads, and they glanced up and saw an immense gray, bat-like creature swooping down toward them out of the dark. It circled round and round the peach, flapping its great wings slowly in the moonlight and staring at the travelers. Then it uttered a series of long, deep, melancholy cries and flew off again into the night.
Oh, I do wish the morning would come,
Miss Spider said, shivering all over.
It won't be long now.
James answered.
Look, it's getting lighter. Over there already.
They all sat in silence, watching the sun as it came up slowly over the rim of the horizon for a new day. And when full daylight came at last, they all got to their feet and stretched their poor, cramped bodies, and then the centipede, who always seemed to see things first, shouted,
Look! It's land below!
He's right.
Right.
they cried, running over to the edge of the peach and peering over.
Hooray, hooray.
Looks like streets and houses.
How enormous it all is.
A vast city, glistening in the early morning sunshine, lay spread out 3,000 feet below them. At that height, the cars were like little beetles crawling along the streets, and people walking on the pavements looked no larger than tiny grains of soot.
But what tremendous tall buildings!
Exclaimed the ladybug.
I've never seen anything like them before in England. What town do you think this is?
This couldn't possibly be England.
Said the old green grasshopper.
And where is it?
Asked Miss Spider.
You know what those buildings are?
Shouted James, jumping up and down with excitement.
Those are skyscrapers. So this must be America. And that, my friends, means we have crossed the Atlantic Ocean overnight.
You don't
I
mean
mean it.
They cried.
Incredible.
Not
it's
possible.
not possible.
It's incredible.
It's unbelievable.
Oh, I've always dreamed of going to America,
Cried the centipede.
even though I have a Brooklyn accent. I have a friend once who,
Be quiet.
Said the earthworm.
Who cares about your friend? The thing we got to think about now is how on earth are we going to get down to Earth?
Well, ask James.
Said the ladybug.
I don't think that should be so very difficult.
James told them.
All we'll have to do is cut loose a few seagulls. Not too many, mind you, but just enough so that the others can't quite keep us up in the air. Then down we shall go, slowly and gently, until we reach the ground. The centipede will bite through the strings for us, one at a time.
Far below them, in the city of New York, something like pandemonium was breaking out. A great round ball as big as a house had been sighted hovering high above the sky over the very center of Manhattan, and the cry had gone out that it was an enormous bomb sent over by another country to blow the whole city to smithereens. Air raid sirens began wailing in every section. All radio and television programs were interrupted with announcements that the population must go down into their cellars immediately. 1 billion people walking in the streets on their way to work looked up in the sky and saw the monster hovering above them and started running for the nearest subway entrance to take cover. Generals grabbed hold of telephones and shouted orders to everyone they could think of. The mayor of New York called up the president of the United States down into Washington, D.C. to ask him for help. And the president, who at that moment was having breakfast in his pajamas, quickly pushed away his half-finished plate of sugar crisps and started pressing buttons right and left to summon his admirals and his generals. And all the way across the vast stretch of America, in all the 50 states, from Alaska to Florida, from Pennsylvania to Hawaii, the alarm was sounded, and the word went out that the biggest bomb in the history of the world was hovering over New York City, and at any moment it might go off.
Come on, Centipede. Right through the first string.
James ordered. The centipede took one of the silk strings between his teeth and bit through it, and once again, but not with an angry cloud man dangling from the end of the string this time, a single seagull came away from the rest of the flock and went flying off on its own.
Bite another,
James ordered. The centipede bit through another string.
Why aren't we sinking?
We are sinking.
No, we're not.
No, we're not.
Don't forget the peach is a lot lighter now than when we first started out.
James told them.
Lost an awful lot of juice when all those hailstones hit it in the night. Cut away 2 more seagulls, Centipede.
Ah, that's better.
There we go.
Now we really are sinking.
Yes, this is perfect. Don't bite any more, Centipede, or we'll sink too fast.
Gently does it.
Slowly, the great peach began losing height, and the buildings and streets down below began coming closer and closer.
Do you think we'll all get our pictures in the paper when we get down?
The ladybug asked.
My goodness! I forgot to polish my boots!
The centipede said.
Everyone has to help me polish my boots before we get there.
Oh, for heaven's sake.
The earthworm said.
Can you stop thinking about...
But he never finished his sentence, for suddenly, whoosh! And they looked up and saw a huge 4-engined plane come shooting out of a nearby cloud and go whizzing past them not more than 20 feet over their heads. This was actually the regular early morning passenger plane coming into New York from Chicago, and as it went by, it sliced right through every single one of the silken strings, and immediately the seagulls broke away, and the enormous peach, having nothing to hold it up in the air any longer, went tumbling down toward the earth like a lump of lead.
Help!
Cried the centipede.
Save us!
Cried the spider.
We are lost!
Cried the ladybug.
This is the end.
Cried the old green grasshopper.
James!
Cried the earthworm.
Do something, James! Quickly do something! James?
I can't.
Cried
sorry.
James.
I'm sorry. Goodbye. Shut your eyes, everybody. It won't be long now.
Round and upside down went the peach as it plummeted toward the earth. And they all were clinging desperately to the stem to save themselves from being flung into space. faster and faster it fell, down and down and down, racing closer and closer to the houses and streets below, where it would surely smash into a million pieces when it hit. And all the way along Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue and along the other sides of the other streets of the city, people who had not yet reached the underground shelters looked up and saw it coming. And they stopped running and stood there staring in a sort of stupor at what they thought was the biggest bomb in all of the world falling out of the sky onto their heads. A few women screamed. Others knelt down on the sidewalks and began praying aloud. Strong men turned to one another and said things like,
I guess
I
this
guess
is
this
it,
is
Joe.
it, Joe. And goodbye, everybody, goodbye. And for the next 30 seconds, the whole city held its breath, waiting for the end to come.
Goodbye, Ladybug.
Gasped James, clinging to the stem of the falling peach.
Goodbye, Centipede. Goodbye, everybody.
There were
Goodbye.
only a few seconds to go now, and it looked as though they were going to fall right in among all of the tallest buildings. James could see the skyscrapers rushing up to meet them at the most awful speed, and most of them had square flat tops. But the very tallest of them all had a top that tapered off into a long, sharp point, like an enormous silver needle sticking up into the sky. And it was precisely onto the top of this needle that the peach fell. There was a squelch. The needle went in deep, and suddenly there was the giant peach, caught and spiked upon the very pinnacle of the Empire State Building. It really was an amazing sight. And in 2 or 3 minutes, as soon as the people below realized that this now couldn't possibly be a bomb, they came pouring out of the shelters and the subways to gape at the marvel. The streets for half a mile around the buildings were jammed with men and women, and when the word spread that they were actually living things moving about on the top of the great round ball, then everyone went wild with excitement.
The flying saucer!
They're from outer
They shouted.
space.
They're men from Mars.
Or maybe they came from the moon.
And a man who had a pair of binoculars to his eyes said,
They look pretty peculiar to me, I'll tell you that.
Police cars and fire engines came screeching in from all over the city and pulled up outside the Empire State Building. 200 firemen and 600 policemen swarmed into the building and went up the elevators as high and as fast as they could go. Then they poured out onto the observation roof, which is the place where tourists stand, just at the bottom of the big spike. All of the policemen were holding their guns at the ready, with their fingers on the triggers, and the firemen were clutching their hatchets. But from where they stood, almost directly underneath the peach, they couldn't actually see the travelers on the top.
Ahoy there.
Shouted the chief of police.
Come out and show yourselves.
Suddenly, the great brown head of the centipede appeared over the side of the peach. His black eyes, as large and as round as 2 marbles, glared down at the policemen and the firemen below. Then his monstrous, ugly face broke into a wide grin.
That wasn't
The
very
policemen... Oh, it wasn't. It was very... No. The policemen and the firemen all started shouting at once.
Look out!
It's a dragon.
It's not a
They
dragon.
cried.
It's not a dragon, it's a lampus.
It's a gorgon.
It's a
Sea
sea
serpent.
serpent.
It's a manticore.
It But 3 firemen and 5 policemen fainted and had to be carried away.
It's a snozwanger.
It's
Cried
a
the chief
wang-doodle.
of police.
It's a wang doodle.
It was a Jabberwocky. No, it really wasn't. Yelled the head of the fire department. The centipede kept on grinning. He seemed to be enjoying enormously the commotion that he was causing.
Now see here.
Shouted the chief of police, cupping his hands to his mouth.
You listen to me. I want you to tell me exactly where you've come from.
We've come from thousands of miles away.
The centipede shouted back, grinning more broadly than ever and showing his big brown teeth.
There you are.
Cried the chief of police.
I told you they came from Mars.
I guess you're right.
Said the head of the fire department. At this point, the old green grasshopper poked his huge green head over the side of the peach alongside the centipedes. 6 more strong men fainted when they saw him.
That one's an oink.
Screamed the head of the fire department.
I just
Or a
know it's an
cockatrice.
oink.
Cried the chief of police.
Stand back, men. It may jump down on us any moment.
What on earth are they talking about?
The old green grasshopper said to the centipede.
Search me.
The centipede answered.
They seem to be in an awful stew about something.
Then Miss Spider's large, black, murderous-looking head, which a stranger was probably the most terrifying of all, appeared next to the grasshoppers.
Snakes and ladders.
Yelled the head of the fire department.
We are finished now. It's a giant scorpula.
It'd be worse than that.
Cried the chief of police.
It'd be a vermicious nid. Oh, just look at its vermicious, gruesome face.
Is that the kind that eats fully grown men for breakfast?
The head of the fire department asked, going white as a sheet.
I am afraid it is.
The chief of police answered.
Oh, please, why doesn't somebody help us to get down from here?
Miss Spider called out.
It's making me giddy.
This could be a trick.
Said the head of the fire department.
Don't anyone make a move until I say.
They've probably got space guns.
Muttered the chief of police.
But we've got to do something.
The head of the fire department announced grimly.
About 5 million people are standing down there on the streets watching us.
Then why don't you put up a ladder?
The chief of police asked him.
I'll stand at the bottom and hold it steady for you while you go up and see what's happening.
Thanks very much.
Snapped the head of the fire department. Soon there were no less than 7 large, fantastic faces peering down over the side of the peach. The centipedes, the old green grasshoppers, the spiders, the earthworms, the ladybugs, the silkworms, and the glowworms. And a sort of panic was beginning to break out among the firemen and the policemen on the rooftop. Then, all at once, the panic stopped, and a great gasp of astonishment went up all around. For now, a small boy was seen to be standing up there beside the other creatures. His hair was blowing in the wind, and he was laughing and waving and calling out.
Oh, hello, everybody, hello.
For a few moments, the men below just stood there, stared and gasped. They simply couldn't believe their eyes.
Bless my soul.
Cried the head of the fire department, going red in the face.
It really is just a little boy, isn't it?
Don't be frightened of us, please.
James called out.
We are so glad to be here.
What about those others beside ye?
Shouted the chief of police.
Are any of them dangerous?
Of course they're not dangerous.
James answered.
They're the nicest creatures in the world. Allow me to introduce you one by one, and then I'm sure you will believe me. My friends, the Centipede. And let me make it known, he's so sweet and gentle that, although he's overgrown, the Queen of Spain, again and again, has summoned him by phone to babysit and sing and knit and be a chaperone when nurse is off and all the royal children are alone.
Small wonder.
Said firemen.
They're no longer on the throne.
The earthworm, on the other hand,
Said James, beginning to expand.
is great for digging up the land and making old soils newer. Moreover, you should understand that he would be absolutely grand for digging subway tunnels and making you a sewer.
The earthworm blushed and beamed with pride. Miss Spider clapped and cheered and cried.
Could any words be truer?
And the grasshopper, ladies and gents, is a boon in millions and millions of ways. You have only to ask him to give you a tune, and he plays and he plays and he plays. As a toy for your children, he's perfectly sweet. There's nothing so good in the shops. You've only to tickle the soles of his feet, and he hops and he hops and he hops.
Can't be very fierce,
Exclaimed the head of all the cops.
And now, without excuse, I'd like to introduce this charming glowworm, lover of simplicity. She is easy to install on your ceiling or your wall, and although this smacks a bit of eccentricity, it's really rather clever. For thereafter you will never, never have the slightest need for using electricity. At which,
Humble narrator.
And here we have
No.
Miss.
At which no less, right here.
At which no less than 52 policemen cried.
If this be true, that creature will get some famous publicity.
and here we have Miss Spider, with a mile of thread inside her, who has personally requested me to say that she's never met Miss Muffet on her charming little tuffet. If she had, she'd not have frightened her away. Should her looks sometimes alarm you, then I don't think it would harm you to repeat at least 100 times a day, I must never kill a spider. I must only help and guide her, and invite her in the nursery to play.
The police all nodded silently, and the firemen smiled politely, and about half a dozen people cried,
Hooray!
And here's my darling Ladybug, so beautiful, so kind, my greatest comfort since this trip began. She had 400 children, and she's left them all behind, but they're coming on the next peach of the can.
the cops cried.
She's entrancing.
And all the firemen started dancing, and the crowds all started cheering to a man.
Whoa!
And now the silkworm,
James went on.
whose silk will bear comparison with all the greatest silks there are in Rome and Philadelphia. If you should search the whole world through, from Paraguay to Timbuktu, I don't think you would find one bit of silk that could compare with it. Even the shops in Singapore don't have the stuff. And what is more, the silkworm had, I'll have you know, the honor not so long ago to spin and weave and spew and press the Queen of England's wedding dress. And she's already made and sent a waistcoat for your president. Oh.
Well, good for her.
The cops cried out, and all at once a mighty shout went up around the Empire State.
Let's get them down at once. Why wait?
5 minutes later, they were all safely down, and James was excitedly telling his story to a group of flabbergasted officials. And suddenly, everyone who came over on the peach was a hero. They were all escorted to the steps of the City Hall, where the mayor of New York made a speech of welcome. And while he was doing this, 100 steeplejacks, armed with ropes and ladders and pulleys, swarmed up to the top of the Empire State Building and lifted the giant peach off the spike and lowered it to the ground. Then the mayor shouted,
"We must now have a ticker tape parade for our wonderful visitors."
and so a procession was formed, and the leading car, which was an enormous open limousine, sat James and all of his friends. Next came the giant peach itself. Men with cranes and hooks had it quickly hoisted onto a very large truck, and there it now sat, looking just as huge and as proud and brave as ever. There was, of course, a bit of a hole in the bottom of it where the spike of the Empire State Building had gone in, but who cared about that? Or indeed about the peach juice that was dripping out of it onto the street. Behind the peach, skidding about all over the place in the peach juice, came the mayor's limousine, and behind the mayor's limousine came about 20 other limousines, all carrying the important people of New York City. And the crowds went wild with excitement. They leaned out of the windows of the skyscrapers, cheering and yelling and screaming and clapping and throwing out bits of white paper and ticker tape, and James and his friends stood up in their cars and waved back there as they went by. Then a rather curious thing happened. The procession was moving slowly along Fifth Avenue when suddenly a little girl in a red dress came out from the crowd and shouted,
"Oh, James, could I please have a tiny taste of your marvelous peach?"
Help yourself.
James shouted back.
Eat all you want. It won't keep forever anyway.
No sooner had he said this than about 50 other children exploded out of the crowd and came running onto the street.
We have some too? We have some too?
They cried.
Of course you can.
James answered.
Everyone have some.
The children jumped up on top of the truck, swarmed like ants all over the peach, eating and eating and eating to their heart's content. And as the news of what was happening spread quickly from street to street, more and more boys and girls came running from all directions to join in the feast. Soon there was a trail of children a mile long, chasing after the peach as it proceeded slowly up Fifth Avenue. Really, it was a fantastic sight. To some people, it looked as though the Pied Piper of Hamelin had suddenly descended upon New York. And to James, who had never dreamed that there could be so many children as this in the world, thought it was the most marvelous thing that had ever happened. By the time the procession was over, the whole gigantic fruit had been completely eaten up, and only the big brown stone in the middle, licked clean and shiny by 10,000 eager little tongues, was left standing on the track. And thus the journey had ended, but the travelers lived on, and every one of them became rich and successful in this new country. The Centipede was made vice president in charge of sales of a high-class firm of boot and shoe manufacturers. The Earthworm, with his lovely pink skin, was employed by a company that made women's face creams to speak commercials on television. The Silkworm and the Spider, after they had both been taught to make nylon thread instead of silk, set upon a factory and set it up to work together and made ropes for rope walkers. The Glowworm became the light inside the torch on the Statue of Liberty, and thus saved a grateful city from having to pay a huge electricity bill every year. The old Green York Symphony Orchestra, where his playing was greatly admired. The Ladybug, who had been haunted all her life by the fear that her house was on fire and that her children all gone, married the head of the fire department and lived happily ever after. And as for the enormous peach stone, it was set up permanently in a place of honor in Central Park and became a famous monument. But it was not only a famous monument, it was also a famous house. And inside the famous house, there lived a famous person, James Henry Trotter himself. And all you had to do any day of the week was go and knock upon the door. And the door would always be open to you, and you would always be asked to come inside and see the famous room where James had first met his friends. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you would find the old green grasshopper in there as well, resting peacefully in a chair before the fire. Or perhaps it would be the Ladybug, who had dropped in for a cup of tea and gossip. Or the Centipede, to show off a new batch of particularly elegant boots that he had just acquired. Every day of the week, hundreds and hundreds of children from far and near came pouring into the city to see the marvelous peach stone in the park. And James Henry Trotter, who once, if you remember, had been the saddest and loneliest little boy that you could find, now had all the friends and playmates in the world. And because so many of them were always begging him to tell the story again and again of his adventures on the peach, he thought it would be nice if one day he sat down and wrote a book. And so he did. And that is what you have just finished reading. Or listening to, as the case may be.
Oh man, God.
The end.
Goodbye.
Yay.
Oh my God. I was not
The
prepared.
end.
I was not prepared for the
I'm a
ladybug.
human who married a ladybug.
Man.
I'm a ladybug who married a fireman.
Wise decision.
Damn.
This, I just want to say
Some of their
thank
things-
you to everyone who's been a part of this. The first thing on our Community
Thanks
X
for having us.
TV channel. We have Chris Ferreira as our narrator. There he is right there. We have Kellie Rock next to me here, who is our cute AF little James. We have Jeff Blanchette next to me over here, who's your old green grasshopper. Down here we have Mitchell Lawson, who has been the light on your screen for however many hours this has been. Below me we have Ben Brown, little Miss Ladybug. Over here we have John Villari, who has been taking the place as the understudy for this episode from Liz Ross, who played the Ladybug. Very in the bottom corner we have Anthony. I forget how to pronounce your last name all of a sudden.
I swear, Ben. I
Cesino.
swear.
His last name is pronounced Cesino.
Thank you, John.
So, who played the Earthworm with his colorful mustache every time? Down there we have Audrey Duarte, who played everyone.
So that's the next show, one woman show.
Who played Aunt Spiker in the beginning, and then we have Sydney Mello, who's not with us right now, but who played the great Aunt Sponge.
Rest in peace.
The late Aunt Sponge, really.
The late Aunt Sponge. And then I guess me, Kellie Brown, who played the Centipede.
What do you mean you guess it happened?
I guess it did. I mean,
Can't prove that.
We can prove it. There's audio and video recording of it, actually.
It's all photoshopped.
Oh.
Somebody recorded this?
I can't.
Man, we gotta do it again.
Say goodnight, Chris.
I did not consent to this.
Good night, everyone.
For real? That's cool.
Say bye, everyone.
Bye.
Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.